Welcome to another episode of the Arts First podcast. I'm Wendy Earle, and my co-host and technical supremo, as ever, is Niall Crowley. Today we have great pleasure in hosting a conversation with Professor Frank Furedi about his recently published book, The War Against the Past, Why the West Must Fight for Its History. Professor Furedi is the author of numerous books in which he astutely examines developments and debates in the modern world, in recent years particularly looking at the culture wars. In his latest book, he argues that our thinking about the past is being colonised by the preoccupations of the present and simultaneously denigrated and exploited by the ideological campaigners and institutional embrace of identity politics. In developing this argument, Furedi examines how history is being rewritten today by writers, artists and curators of various stripes. Many assume a kind of moral superiority over great artists and thinkers of the past, such as William Shakespeare and Immanuel Kant, and he suggests that this reframing of history through the prism of identity politics is undermining the possibility of the past being a creative resource for thinking about the future. Instead, it creates a sense of being trapped in an endless but ever-changing present. Many of the examples Furedi uses in his book focus on the arts, so we were keen for him to join us to elaborate on these examples. And we invited JJ Charlesworth, a friend of the podcast, a writer and an art critic, and a close observer of what is happening in the world of the arts and culture, to lead the conversation. So we're delighted they both agreed to participate. And now I hand you over to JJ. I hope you enjoy the episode.
Frank, it's obviously been a great joy and inspiration to read The War Against the Past, because it does really it very much makes an analysis and a much bigger argument about why our society, our culture at the moment has such a antagonistic take on everything that has gone on in the past. And because it makes the argument that this dissociation that contemporary society in the West has developed towards the past is a, first of all, a very long process and has been a long time in coming and has gone through a number of phases that have moved away from seeing the past something to be the cherished or to be looked on as a resource for contemporary society, towards a situation where everything about the past is treated with suspicion and then eventually condemned. And one of the arguments you make is that one of the drivers for that, one of the kind of dynamics within that, is that we have very much also lost kind of perspective on the future and the idea that we might actually be able to do something about the future in the present. So as far as I understand your kind of interpretation, it's because it's partly as a result of having lost our sense of history making and future making in that sense, that we've become, firstly, as a culture, or our elites, our cultural and institutional elites, have become increasingly concerned about taking on the past as if it was something to fix, as if it was something to correct, and in which the past is only really a catalogue of iniquities, oppressions, injustices, and violence. So those are the kind of broader, the big themes that I see in the book. But of course, the reality is that the book touches constantly on culture, and particularly the arts, the museum, the place of the history of literature in our society, and how we have decided to relate ourselves to what are often cultural phenomena that come to us from the past. So statues, museum artifacts, archaeological records, the history of literature, theatre, and so on. So I guess for the Arts First podcast and the kinds of discussions we've been having, I wanted to kind of maybe relate some of the things that you discuss in the book, in particular to things that have been going on in the arts and culture. You draw a very interesting distinction between a present which is obsessed with critiquing and taking down past figures, past episodes and periods in society, and the legacy of broadly Western cultural history and civilizational history. But you also point out that you make this argument about presentism and about the fact that whilst we are constantly critiquing, or people are constantly criticizing elements of the past, we're also living in something which you describe as a presentist moment, a time in which our sense of the present seems to expand to completely absorb everything about the past. So, and of course, one of the consequences of this, one of the symptoms of this, ends up in the cultural realm. So I just wondered if you would perhaps outline this idea of presentism that you make an important case for in the book, and the notion of anachronism, because I think these are very interesting ways to deal with some of the weirder and crazier symptoms in the arts and in culture more widely at the moment.
Well, I think what I'm trying to get at is that for a number of reasons, the conventional temporal boundaries have broken down. And this has meant that increasingly that we seem to be almost trapped in the present, to the point at which there is no attempt, or no serious attempt to develop a future-oriented culture, or develop your cultural imagination in such a way that you can see possibilities that are different than the here and now. And for me, that's very much linked to the fact that at the same time, there is a growing tendency to use the past as a medium through which a sort of through which people begin to sort of try to find some kind of a meaning in their life. And the way you do it is by fixing the past, essentially colonizing the past. And what you have is a situation where you, on the one hand, render the past toxic by arguing that everything about what has gone on before is bad, but at the same time as demonizing the past, what you're also doing, this is what's happening culturally, is you're trying to sort of go back and rewrite things to the point at which they become a form of self-flattery. And what I really talk about is the way in which people become invested in inserting themselves into episodes in the past in a way that they come across as the colleagues or the peers of the people that they criticize. And so basically you have a situation where people discuss Shakespeare as if he was, around, sitting next to them, and explaining to Shakespeare why the language he uses has got to be changed in order to render more explicit his inner racist thoughts. So what they're really saying is they know better than Shakespeare what's really going on in his head. And through that kind of arrogant, patronizing way, they kind of feel free to teach Shakespeare a lesson in the way that you would do a child in the here and now. And there's this ever-present, what I call ever-present, goes further and further back in history. So it becomes increasingly a caricature of itself, because what you're then doing is you're looking at the ancient world, you're looking at medieval Europe, and through the medium of anachronism, you're like treating them as if, again, they have the same values as we do. They can be judged in accordance with the same standards as people that are around now. And we forget the fact that the reason why we have the sensitivities, the standards, is because people through centuries have struggled to intellectually and morally develop these kind of sensitivities. And it's thanks to them that we're in a position to be critical, to question, to see the importance of empathy. I mean, all these things did not, grow on a tree. They're not acts of nature. They're human accomplishments, which we're now rubbishing for not being as up to date as we are, forgetting the fact that actually we have a lot to thank them for. And that's something that a bit of humbleness on our part would readily grasp and understand.
The examples you give about how Shakespeare is often actually in certain instances literally rewritten to conform better to or current preoccupations about, say, racism or whiteness, or the kinds of issues that preoccupy cultural producers and artists who are essentially now set on a particular perspective that is, broadly speaking, identitarian, which is rooted in identity politics, which is something that you identify as an important component here. That attempt to recast the culture of the past comes from all kinds of aspects of identity politics, doesn't it? Because you mentioned, for example, that people, academia and cultural commentators and artists are now constantly trying to find the queering of even ancient culture. In fact, you notice it quite frequently when it comes to the Romans, right? There are episodes of Doctor Who, who's the great anachronist in a sense, in his current sort of incarnation, or her current incarnation, where episodes where the Doctor goes back to Roman Britain, discovers that all the Roman soldiers are basically gay, or indulge in gay sex because they don't see the distinction that we do. But it's very interesting the way you argue it, because of course what you're suggesting is that identity politics wants to first of all erase everything that it detests: whiteness, patriarchy, capitalism, but reinstitute, but overwrite it with all the artifacts, all the kinds of modes of thinking around identity that are current now, back into all these historical moments. But that leads to a strong falsification, doesn't it? I mean, I think one of the weirdest things I've found recently in contemporary culture is what is called colorblind casting, but is actually the complete contempt for the idea of historical accuracy in film drama, right? So it started with kind of light-hearted or popular entertainment, like say Bridgerton, the installing of black actors or Asian actors, but essentially non-white actors in roles which one might have considered in a period drama to be a world populated by white people. But most recently, we've seen this also with the new adaptation of the second series of Wolf Hall, where some people are complaining that one of Henry VIII's court is now acted by a black man. So there's a very interesting kind of sensation to this culturally, because on one hand, we're being told that we shouldn't pay attention to things like historical accuracy, because the principle of casting people of color in roles which might have been historically understood as white characters or white historical figures, the ethics of doing that trumps historical accuracy. And I think you kind of touch on this idea that essentially, historians have become partisan, that they no longer wish that there's a big argument to reject the idea that the historian should be objective. I just wondered if you would go through that a little bit, because it's not simply something which affects the study of history and historians, but it seems to bleed into a kind of universal indifference for things like representation that might want to be accurate, for want of a better word.
Well, I think there's two sides to it. There is the lack of interest in being accurate, and arguing that history is not really objective and you can almost make it up as you go along, to which I'm sometimes a little bit sympathetic. I don't particularly care if a white character is played by a black person any more than if a black person is played by a white person. I think that's part of drama, that's part of acting. What I do worry about is when you go way beyond that and argue that actually there's a presence of certain kinds of people in medieval England or in Tudorian England, or even in the Anglo-Saxon era, which is just historically false. So you now have a situation where it's been suggested that black people, were the original natives in Britain, and they preceded, sort of white people. And similar arguments are made in a very expensive 10-part TV show in Sweden, which basically the very first sort of part of this whole drama, historical drama, is to argue that in fact the Vikings were black rather than white, which is like totally absurd. And I could go on and give you loads and loads of examples. So you have on the one hand, not just an indifference to objective history, but also the insistence that you're not just simply rewriting history, you're making it up entirely. I mean, that's more or less what's going on. And that's very different than what happened in the past. People would revise history, which is quite legitimate. They would reinterpret history. That's okay. But to entirely make it up is something that is relatively new. And this making up of the past, this kind of imaginary fantasy past, is also really driven by identity politics, because although identitarians want to get rid of the past in one sense and create this year zero ideology, at the same time, they also use the past to naturalize and normalize their own identity. So from a trans ideology point of view, it's quite important that you discover and rediscover the presence of large numbers of trans people in ancient Rome, in ancient Greece, in ancient Egypt. And I write about the fact that in the book that very often they now argue that it's no longer legitimate in archaeological digs to, for example, identify the remains of some of the humans as either man or woman on the grounds that we don't know how they would identify. So the very idea that somehow people had an idea of identifying according to different genders 2,000 years ago is a grotesque, sort of imposition of your own sensibilities on a world that didn't even have a word for gender, never mind identifying with something that simply did not exist. So you also have this desire to normalize and naturalize your own identity, and everybody is doing it. All the different identity groups are doing it. They're all saying that who we are, what we're about, is not something that we invented. It's not something that just come about recently. It's been the norm, but it's been hidden from history. There's been a conscious attempt to not acknowledge us. And there's that kind of, in that way, you kind of combine your status as a victim with this claim that, you are actually a part of history in the way that it's been denied by I suppose, Western intellectual, cultural establishment. So that's a big worry, in a sense, that history has now become something that is entirely politicized to the point at which it ceases to have any kind of connection with real developments, with anything that's remotely factually correct or anything that's been debated in the past. It's a different kind of version of what has gone on beforehand that is entirely sort of contaminated by present day obsessions of identity politics.
One of the things that I have been kind of discussing sometimes quite frequently now with people in the arts, and I think it relates in a particular way to what you've just been setting out, is the idea of tradition in the for a long time I was very indifferent to it, because as a good postmodernist, or rather someone who grew up in an arts sector which was working through what might have been called aesthetic postmodernism. The past was there as a sort of resource to manipulate, to play with, to remix, and so on. And the idea of tradition, certainly in the visual arts, the history of a discipline, was treated with a high degree of indifference, and the idea of novelty and the idea of making things which were new, in the sense that they were kind of critical of a modernist past, was very much all the rage for a long time. But I noticed that in other disciplines where tradition, the idea of the repertoire or the idea of the canon, still matter a great deal more. Say, for example, in dance or ballet or classical music, I've been surprised and quite dismayed by the fact that even aesthetic traditions under threat, because people don't want to talk about what's good about art form. So art forms have a history of innovation and of continuity, and these are themes that you kind of touch on in a broader sense in the book. But it's quite striking now that we no longer really want to, in the arts, want to defend or even argue for the fact that if you want to do something, if you want to pursue, say, a career and a vocation in a certain art form, the idea of discipline and the history of your art form should be something you care about. What's striking now is that everybody is always transgressing and challenging norms. So I wonder if you might say something to the idea that norms have basically collapsed, and the idea of tradition has been how that came to be, that we take absolutely nothing from the past. Because it does strike me that now we see, say, I was just seeing one thing in The Guardian just a day or two ago, which was headlined, "The Gender Fluid Mary, Queen of Scots Ballet to debut at Edinburgh Festival 2025. So this is an article entirely about the fact that a ballet, and I think ballet is one of those things which is always a target for this kind of revisionism, is going to challenge people to revise their their comfortable notions about what ballet is simply through querying or a more fluid approach to who performs what on stage. Now, I'm not particularly worried about artists experimenting, but what's interesting is, of course, there's no real interest in that article about ballet or what might be good about it. So it becomes a kind of almost it seems to be like quite a repetitive thing now to validate, and perhaps this comes back to your kind of issue of the kind of eternal present, to validate experimentation and novelty and innovation, but in a way which has no reference to what has gone on previously in that discipline or in that form. Now, I'm curious about that because it's where do things go if that's the state that we're in? That's kind of what I think I take you to be arguing around the idea of the eternal present. I mean, what actually is produced by our current state of affairs, our cultural disassociation or disenfranchisement from, or disinheritance from the past? Because it does seem to relate to the idea that we aren't progressing, or that the idea of progress is finished. Where do we go from here?
Well, that's a difficult question. I mean, the way that I see it is that there's nothing wrong with experimentation and nothing wrong with artistic innovation, or even playing around with different forms and trying to see, where that leads you. I mean, this has been going on particularly since the modernist epoch, but even beforehand. But I think what's happening now is something a little bit different, because at the moment the impulse is towards, as you were suggesting, the breaking of boundaries, of transgressing. But the paradox is that if everybody's breaking boundaries and if everybody's transgressing, then the meaning of transgression has changed altogether. It's basically, when you're kicking against an open door, which is what's happening at the moment, there's no risk in the act of transgression. One of the reasons why transgressions were seen as being quite interesting in certain historical moments was because it involved a fairly high cost. It involved an act of bravery to some extent, to put yourself out on the line. Whereas today, it's the very opposite. It's the people who, in a sense, work with traditional forms, or who are trying to develop traditional sort of artistic forms that are, in a sense, the countercultural, the genuine countercultural artists. So we have this very interesting development where art itself has become sort of completely indifferent to its own purpose, and it's become entirely instrumentalized for purposes that are external to itself, and both in terms of serving a cause, and in that sense, it's not different than political art in the Soviet era or in the Nazi era, but it is different in one other respect, because at least the Soviet or the Nazi or all these other fascistic artists were artists. They were interested in art. Unfortunately, they tried to subordinate its aesthetic quality to a political agenda, but at least it was art. And it was really an attempt to kind of somehow focus on the content of what they were doing. Whereas today, when you have this so-called transgressive art, which is boasting about the fact that it's leaving everything behind, where you can almost tell in advance that you're not going to have a play, a Shakespearean play, or a Walter Scott novel, and anything else resembling what it was, but has become almost like this kind of resource that you cannibalize and recast in light of your own identity obsession. That something else is really going on here, and you basically are in the business of making what are fairly puerile, contentless statements. The statement is not about what's in the content of the art. The statement is about the fact that you've transgressed, that you are so brave. You're calling out the racism of Tchaikovsky, or you're calling out all these other things that people have done in the past. And I think that is very interesting. So Now, when I hear the word transgression, yeah, I no longer see a brave artist, sort of struggling against the odds. I just see a huckster, a kind of artistic entrepreneur talking the talk and playing the role that is the part of the convention at the moment. It's an act of conformism, which is the very opposite to transgression than anything else.
I just wanted to touch. I mean, I think that what spins out from that for me is that we have a weird, very strange situation now where institutions that are meant to have certain criteria and purposes and objectives are in a state where they seem to be only interested in sort of internally dismantling everything that they once stood for. And that could be, the conservatoire, the way in which particular artistic genres are now kind of completely caught up and paralyzed by a sort of desire to self-critique on the basis of all these extrinsic critical agendas that are coming towards them, whether it's decolonization or queering, or these are institutions now that are both in crisis, but also in a slightly more worrying way, actively in the business of dismantling what good they're good for in the first place. So, you touch on museums, and particularly archaeological museums that are trusted with, whose role is the care and the preservation and the development and the presentation of knowledge to a public about historical artifacts. And I wonder, where can you see that those institutions can survive? Because I think I cannot see it in the arts particularly, and then particularly in those art forms that have a kind of more established sense of the repertoire or the canon, where they go from here, other than, as you say, to kind of produce a kind of constantly and repetitively a transgressive form, which has essentially nothing to transgress anymore because it's taken over. So I wonder, for us, how long does this go on for? Or rather, does it have a destructive dynamic which will lead itself somewhere terrible? Or is it something that we need to, how do we find our way to making a case against the way in which our cultural institutions have, to a large extent, been colonized by this agenda and this perspective?
I think it's important not to get too pessimistic. I mean, it's very tempting to feel that this development is very powerful and it's very unrestrained, and it's got all kinds of institutional backing at the moment. This is really the only show in town, and therefore it's a very powerful hegemonic force. But I would say that art and the artistic enterprise usually provokes reactions, and I would imagine that there will be individuals or groups of individuals who will, in a sense, react against the attempt to force this kind of conformist outlook upon them. And they might provide them kind of a vision of art which is maybe a bit more conservative, or it's one that is challenging the status quo. And I think that the really important thing for us is to try to build some kind of a countercultural sort of movement in the arts, as in most other domains of everyday life, as a way of challenging it, but also as a way of indicating that there's something great about the beauty of art that's been, in a sense, reproduced generation after generation after generation. I know that's something I'm working on in my job, where we had events on beauty. What is beauty? We had events on why is classical music being attacked as elitist and racist. So we're kind of looking at all these things, because at the end of the day, it's quite important that we, at the very least, we begin a discussion around the subject, because the fate of art is not simply an issue for the artist or the connoisseurs of that art. It's something that is essentially important for the whole of society. And we have to get intelligent and sensitive people to become aware of the fact that if our artistic legacy, the legacy of the fine art, is lost or is seriously compromised, that has got very important consequences for society, because these are essential resources that we can build on to develop and enhance our imagination. And the human imagination, again, is not something that's just born on a tree. You can just start anew. Our imagination is rooted in, amongst other things, historical and artistic experiences that go back a very, very long time. So I think that the important thing for us is not to give in to these forces, these hegemonic forces, but to ask the question, what can we do to kind of create some kind of countercultural moment where we encourage people with a degree of artistic sensitivity to be a little bit braver, to experiment, in fact, because real experimentation today doesn't mean that you do what people often do in street art and everything else. Real experimentation involves taking the traditions of our artistic legacy, taking it forward and giving it life and developing it, which is really how our civilizing impulses go forward. They go on forward on the basis of taking our tradition, not being complacent and just sitting on it, but making it relevant by developing it, in a way that is appropriate, that kind of captures our sensibility in the here and now.
Do you think that you've ever noticed artwork of any sort that's come out of this culture, this cultural moment that you valued? Because I think we're always in the danger of kind of pushing against what seems to be an imposition on, and becoming very reactive to, as you say, things which are sometimes essentially attempts to experiment to see what might be possible with a certain kind of good faith logic to say, well, what if we did it like this? What if we weren't beholden to certain kind of traditions? But I struggle to ask myself if I've ever seen anything that really does come up with the goods, and I wonder if it's essentially because nothing is centered on the artwork, and it's always centered on the ethics and the polemics and the agenda which is being foisted. But I don't know. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but I have to say I haven't found anything yet. I wonder if you have.
Not really. I mean, it's interesting because the last time that I was kind of aesthetically turned on and I felt really excited was in May this year, when my wife and I went to Madrid, and there was a Goya sort of exhibition where they were essentially showing Goya's sort of drawings, the drawings that he made before he painted them. And it was a really intelligently put together collection where I don't know how they got all these drawings from all over the place. And so you could see the development of Goya's works kind of almost like step by step until the final painting. And I remember just kind of going away. It was very simple. It wasn't like anything, that fancy. And I just remember being very excited by this, sort of just the way in which the curators managed to put the whole thing together. So that kind of sort of work is still being done, so people are able to make good use of the different bits of their collection. And that told me that, hope is not lost, because even if I don't like, I'm not very excited by a Banksy drawing, nevertheless, there are all these other things around that are still there. I mean, I'm living in Belgium now. You go to Antwerp and you go to Ghent, all you got to do is go to any old church, sort of, and you're bound to find something that will kind of catch your eyes and hold your attention, and you just kind of almost, your skin comes alive from the excitement of seeing something that is visually, very attractive. So in that sense, even if you don't find anything in the here and now that kind of nails it for us, nevertheless, there's all this other stuff out there that can provide us with that kind of aesthetic therapy that we need to sort of make our way in the world.
Great, thank you.
All right. Well, good luck with the podcast.
Thanks, Frank.
Thanks, Frank, JJ, and Wendy, and thank you for listening to Arts First. We really appreciate your suggestions and your support, and we've still got more shows coming up between now and the end of the year. If you're not already subscribed, please check out our Substack website at artsfirst.uk. Finally, we'd like to express our gratitude to friends and listeners who've been kind enough to support us with donations. We're looking to build a small fund to help us expand what we do. If you'd like to make a donation, we'd be very happy. We've just set up a Just Giving page, which you can find on our Substack site. Thank you. See you next time.